Okay, I think we are recording.
Excellent. Okay, thank you all for being here in the room and online. And this is our fifth stakeholder meeting for the Tier 3 working group effort, Tier 3 rulemaking for Act 250. And I'm Alex Weinhagen. I think we all know each other now, so maybe I'll dispense with the introductions and we'll just sort of do a little table setting and then get down to business. So the reason we're here today is to continue talking about the first rough draft of the Tier 3 rules, which this group began its review of and commenting on at the July 15th meeting. And unfortunately, I did not schedule enough time. We ran out of time at that meeting. And so today, my real hope is that we can get through the rest of the draft, make sure to answer as many of your questions or all of your questions, and get whatever comments you have at this point. So that's why we're here. That's the purpose of today's meeting. I did schedule this one for longer. I don't anticipate we're going to need 3 hours, but we're scheduled from 9 to noon just so that we didn't have the same problem all over again. To the extent that we're able to work through everyone's comments and get out of here early, that's totally fine. To the extent we use the whole time, that is totally fine as well. So to give you a little bit of an update from where we left it on July 15th, since that meeting, I've gone to the board, and sorry, Kirsten Sultan, who's in the room here, is one of our 5 board members that I serve with on the Land Use Review Board. And so I brought the draft and some of your comments to the board at a series of meetings over the last week and a half or so, 4 meetings actually. Some of you sat in on some of those, so you heard some of the conversation. And my intent was to update the board, to start to get their feedback, and just to help move the ball forward, but also to get their authorization to slow it down. So originally the plan was to have our stakeholder input through July, have the board have an initial look at it in that time horizon as well, and then make some tweaks and changes and roll it out again, a first draft, but a slightly improved first draft to the public, to the Vermonters in August. And then we would do a series of public meetings, and then we would come back and work on a next draft and move forward from there. All of that was centered on meeting a legislative mandate to hand over proposed Tier 3 rules to the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules, LCAR, by February 1st. So basically after your feedback on July 15th, where there were a lot of concerns and questions and just, confusion about, what I had put together for that first rough draft, I wanted to go to the board and say, listen, this isn't ready for prime time yet, and we're not going to make that February deadline. We need more time. And the board agreed. And so we'll be asking the legislature for an extension of that February deadline, which is not a big deal. Because I think I explained early on, the Tier 3 rules per statute don't actually go into effect until December 31st of next year. So there was always been this sort of odd gap between when the rules were supposed to be sort of put together in February and when they actually take effect. So we're going to take advantage of that gap and assume that we'll be delivering the rules to LCAR next summer instead of in February. So that gives us a time to take a breath. And I still, am the eager beaver and I'm optimistic that we can come up with a revised draft and go out to the public in October of this year. We'll see how we do on that front. So in any case, that's the scheduling change that Kirsten and the rest of the board members felt comfortable approving, even though we technically need to ask the legislature as well. So we have a little bit of time. So again, with that in mind, I really want to get the rest of your comments, questions, and feedback on this first rough draft, and then know that the plan is to revise it substantially, come up with another draft, before we go out to the public in October. Hopefully one that's more understandable, more complete, and also will have, better sort of public level presentation materials to go along with it. So it's more understandable. That's the process. A little bit of, commentary. The board in their 4 meetings over the last week and a half or so had a lot of similar questions and concerns that this group had. And so, there's a lot to sort of synthesize and then work on revisions based on. We also discussed this with our Act 250 staff just 2 days ago at one of our all staff meetings, so that our district coordinators, who are going to be in the hot seat of actually determining jurisdiction when this all comes into effect, would have an opportunity to pose questions and the like. So we got some feedback from our staff, and that's continuing to roll in over the next couple weeks as well. So just know that we're going to have your feedback, the board's feedback from our staff to inform the next draft before we then go out and try to explain it to Vermonters and get their feedback. My hope is that we'll have a series of public meetings around the state in October, if we can get there in a timely fashion. So I'm happy to talk a little bit about what Kirsten and the other board members, said about the draft and what their thoughts were, but I'm actually less interested in rehashing that with you. I'm more interested in just continuing the conversation at your level to get your questions and feedback. And where we left it last time was that we had walked through the protection gap analysis spreadsheet that Jamie helped start, and then I sort of fleshed out that walks us through all the resources that we've talked about as a group that might be considered for tier 3, and then highlights which ones are in the first draft. And then we went and I walked you through how each of those sort of 3 resource areas, some of them are an amalgamation of others, how those are defined in the first draft. And I believe we looked at some mapping to show you some of the good parts and then some of the anomalies within that mapping of those resources. But that's where we ran out of time. We didn't have time to talk about, just the definition section in the draft, which is very rough and preliminary. We didn't have too much time to talk about when jurisdiction triggers and this whole concept of impact-based jurisdiction rather than just sort of placement jurisdiction. And that revolves around the first draft, including this 15,000 square feet of impact before the trigger kicks in. And we didn't have time to talk about the exemptions or the potential for a reduced review process within a project that actually does trigger Act 250. So those are all items that I want to work through with you. But we have a small group today, and so hopefully we can dive in. And I don't want to dominate if anybody has been chomping at the bit to ask a question on a particular section of the draft or just this whole concept as we're pulling it together. So I'm going to stop talking for just a moment and turn it over to you and say, is there something from the last meeting that's been eating at you that you want to ask about that could start the conversation today? If not, I'll blather on longer and poke you with questions. But anyone have a question or comment?
So Alex, maybe while everyone's thinking about that, I'll just fill you in on to the tier 3 schedule is on the board's agenda for next Monday's meeting.
Okay, great.
Alongside tier 2 schedule. So it's just, as you said,
More
the board had
conversation.
discussed on there was consensus around allocating, going to the legislature to ask for more time for the tier 3 report and also for the tier 2 report, for probably both of them asking through September of 26. But the board will be more, getting possibly voting if needed, or just more formalizing that on Monday. It's on the agenda, both of those.
Thanks, Kirsten.
Yeah, Alex has been out part of the week, so I'm just catching him up a little
That also lines up better, quite frankly, with the 8A criteria in terms of the deadline, isn't that next summer?
bit. 8C.
8C, so
8C, yes, July 1 is when the 8C, sorry, that's not true. December 31st of next year is when 8C kicks in as well. It's the road rule, it's July 1. So yeah, everything can sync up and we can take that extra time into next year as we need it.
And there's some overlap between this, you know.
Well, that's what I was gonna say. I
Yeah.
think there's some overlap between some of the concepts and we're
Yeah.
talking on tier 3 and.
Yes, for sure, for sure. So thanks for the interlude.
Yeah.
Again, happy to poke you with questions, but does anybody want to get us started with something they've been thinking about or?
Looks like Josh.
Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, just in the effort of things I didn't want to forget because it hadn't come up yet. But at the bottom of the draft, you've got some comments about discussions that might not be needed. And the one around trails, I've just been meaning to ask some questions on, the total 2,500 linear feet, is less than a half a mile. A lot of trails are, a lot longer than that, and just how that relates in this. I think that spelling out some sort of exemption, at least we should talk about, seeing that some of these natural communities and these places, folks are gonna some access to come see, as long as it's not impacting that natural resource. And just wanted to say that's something I wanted to make sure we had some discussion on before it was moved on from. That's all.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, when Charlie and I chatted after our last meeting, that item came up as well. And trails and Act 250 jurisdiction are complicated already. But I think, Charlie, we sort of were in agreement that, like, Josh is right. We need more language in the draft that addresses trails, given that, the types of impacts that we would see from somebody adding a garage, are potentially much smaller than a long linear trail, across a property. The 15,000 square feet, isn't really set up for trail impact per se. Anyone have thoughts they want to share on, where we might go with trails in relation to tier 3 jurisdiction?
So if I could just add to that, I think, so we've got Rule 71 right now, which impacts this. And then there's also work happening right now with the department, the Vermont Trails and Greenways Council, and some other partners to develop trail system BMPs. So there's a process already underway that's looking at this. And so I think whatever we do in this draft, we just want to make sure that those things kind of align so that we don't have two different things happening going off in different directions.
Can I ask you a quick question? So is that the focus of that work? It's BMPs, or is there a regulatory component, or?
I'm not sure. I know I haven't been part of the process. I know that it's ongoing. I think one of the big focuses was around best management practices. But it seems like that process and that group might be an entity that can be brought into this conversation because of the work they're doing. And I think kind of from the department standpoint, we've been looking at that as maybe trying to tie up some loose ends and provide more clarity to this question around trails, which has been kind of a bigger thing with an Act 250, people call it the hornet's nest, and so I think the concern is that, like, we don't want to do anything here that would further kind of like make that more complicated or kick that hornet's nest, if there is a solution moving forward there.
Yeah, and the consistency with Rule 71, as Charlie said, seems important to sort of noodle through.
Well, yeah, just maybe that some of the outcomes with that other review process that's underway inform what might occur, or how trails are handled in tier 3. Like it may have some relevancy, like good information.
Yeah.
But so thanks for letting us know.
Jamie, did you have something before we go to Annette?
Well, I think, for years, there's been discussions around, potentially trying to find an alternative to, the existing jurisdictional approach in Act 250 and look at maybe a different program. There's been some good thinking around it. So I think if that process ultimately leads to a proposal to replace, Act 250 review with something, it has to have a citing component to it, like to promote good citing.
Yep.
For now, I think it's it's difficult because if we're talking about like maybe a natural community or there's certain resources where a trail, you know, could have an impact on it.
Right.
And then if it's sited well, it may not have a lot of impacts. So I guess it's always hard to figure out like what's the arbitrary, like, you know, delineation of where you would say this trail's long enough. We really need good sighting, and that will go a long way. But so I think like an outright exemption doesn't feel like the right policy, but trying to find some reasonable sweet spot to understand how do we review legitimate impacts, and then what should be considered de minimis.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jamie. Annette?
Yeah, I was going to say that I have no clarity on trails because it's been such a, I don't know, a football for so long. But I will say that this process of these stakeholder groups has been really valuable in clarifying for me the value of Act 250. And this talk of exemptions, I'm going to explain and expose my bias that has grown in favor of Act 250, which has become a boogeyman, and all of these efforts to get all these different exemptions, I think, are incredibly misplaced. I will move on from the trail issue to say that I think the section on exemptions in this draft rule should be completely eliminated. That was never my understanding of how Tier 3 was supposed to be in place. It was supposed to be additional, and that any idea of exempting a Tier 3 area from other criteria, I have no idea where that came from. I missed one meeting, and maybe it was discussed there, but otherwise, I am not clear where it came from. The one thing we did not do at our last meeting, but that you did, Alex, at the Land Use Review Board meeting, was to actually look at some areas on a map. And the more that I look at areas that I'm familiar with, including one that happens to affect me personally, which is, I think, a great example of the deficiencies of what we're coming up with here. But I sent you an email the other day that had 5 different cases from the Public Utility Commission where they already evaluate wildlife habitat connectivity and forest fragmentation. And looking at some of those areas, I'm really not seeing that this Tier 3, these 3 different items that we've identified are necessarily going to address the areas that have been identified. And the other day I attended the Vermont Conservation Design public outreach meeting and wonder if you are in discussion with the folks doing that, because I sent you a screenshot of something that Jens Hilke put out that identified some areas that we haven't looked at, such as mature forests. So I really appreciate the time that's being put into this, but in terms of the outcomes, the 3 things that are shown on the map, I mean, I'd be glad to show the group what I'm talking about in Danby. I think it's a very good example of how this is not going to work. And I could share my screen, or I could have you pull up the map and have you zoom in on it.
Yeah, you reminded me, Annette, that I think you're right. I don't think we did do much browsing of the map at our July 15th meeting. So I think it'd be worthwhile to do that in the same way that I, as you said, I did during these recent board meetings. But let me do that when we get there. I want to, I took note of your 2 basic comments, which is that, the exemptions in general are overdone. You're recommending eliminating exemptions and also questioning this concept of a reduced review criteria. And then, yes, the mapping. I think we should look at that. So if there's nothing else on trails, just knowing that we've bookmarked that as, an item that needs some additional attention.
Just on trails, like, to be totally frank, like, Act 250 needs to figure out how they're applying jurisdiction to trails.
Mm-hmm.
before we include it in tier 3. It's just like that. It needs to be that sequence. To say that trails are jurisdictional in trail 3 is just going to be a nightmare to manage.
Because the current rules related to them, you just don't think
Yeah,
are
we've
workable?
got the Velomont Trail, which is a massive statewide trail where they've built tons of miles already that there's no jurisdiction, but there's these tiny little trails that pop up that certain coordinators are saying are jurisdictional. So it's completely inconsistent. There's no transparency. It's not fair. And like they do run in these areas. So like I feel like that needs to be fixed before we pull them into this, which is really intended to capture development that's going to impact these resources in a permanent way.
Right, but to Jamie's point, Billy, if a trail does cross a tier 3 area and therefore could have an impact on it, is it necessary that Act 250 program has its hands around trails in general, or is it in a tier 3 concept actually a much easier question?
The marginal impact a trail is going to have in any one of these areas versus other forms of development, I don't know. I feel like just as far as like a good government perspective, like having clarity about how Act 250 regulates trails is a precursor to having them be part of a new jurisdictional program. That's just my own view.
Gotcha.
And then like, what's going to happen? Is it just going to regulate the section of trail that crosses the tier 3 resource? Okay, but they'll probably just move the trail there, which I guess is a good outcome. But it seems like it's getting the cart before the horse, in my view.
All right.
Yep.
Well, let's move on to trails, unless somebody has more trail comments.
I was just going to second Billy's concern that I think for something as small as trails, the backlash from the rural parts of the state over getting this wrong for small linear could be dramatic. You know, and being careful about what is the real impact we're trying to prevent by not taking the time to for regular Act 250's jurisdiction on trails to be figured out, because it is not universal, it's not clear, and it could really upend, I think, some of this tier 3 work in a way that's unintended if jump into this without getting it right. So I'll just second that.
Yeah,
Got
I'd like to push back a little on that. And the idea that trails don't have a major impact on the environment is, I think, misplaced. I always like to be reminded of Sue Morse's comment about how would you like someone traipsing through your bedroom, speaking for the wildlife. And I do think that these trails can have a lot of impacts, including washouts. We've seen lots of trail damage from storms. And so in addition to the significant natural communities, there are a lot of people who are aware of and concerned about the Velomont Trail and the increased disturbance of wild areas from the mountain biking and that are they're being built by some company out west that comes in and uses Western practices on our much more sensitive mountains. So I don't want to minimize the impacts that trails have. This is not a minor issue.
All right. Appreciate the back and forth on that. Let's move on. So trails was one place to start the conversation. Anybody else have an idea or an issue from July 15th that they're yearning to interject? Yes, Charlie.
One area I was hoping we could talk about today is, and this touches on, I think, definitions, applicability, and the exemption sections, is how we're thinking about how tier 3 impacts with farming, but more importantly, forestry and the ability to practice forestry. Because we've talked about kind of maintaining some of the current exemptions within Act 250, but then some of the language doesn't really conflict with that, or it does conflict with that. And I guess thinking about it even more after we spoke, I guess I'd like to get a better idea of like what the actual intention is in terms of what the hope is in terms of how forestry and logging intersects with tier 3. And I acknowledge that like there's some nuance there around what is the practice of forestry and logging versus what is potentially clearing something for a future development, and how that can be really tricky to negotiate. So there's a lot of nuance here, but at a big picture, I guess I was hoping to get some more clarity on what is the intention of how we're going to do this work in this area, and from there we can drill down into like what might need to get tweaked in the language.
Gotcha. Yeah, so that's a good question. And everyone else didn't benefit from our side conversation a couple days after that July 15th meeting. So I'm gonna give you a couple different slices. So our prior discussions on this element talked about wanting to preserve the current exemption for farming and for forestry that are already in Act 250. So not having those activities subject to Act 250 jurisdiction within a tier 3 area. That's what I heard anyways from our prior meetings. And so that I wrote this draft with that in mind. And it's somewhat inartful the way it does it, but in the applicability session, it talks about the existing exemptions in statute flowing into the tier 3 jurisdiction as well. So what's exempt currently would remain exempt even for forestry in a tier 3 area. So that's how I intended to draft it. That was based on our conversations. With that said, I think that both at the board meeting and to some extent during our staff meetings over the last 2 weeks, there's been some pushback on that and some questioning about, well, if these are the most sensitive resources, why wouldn't there be jurisdiction over forestry in those areas? And so my pushback on our program was, I think that your department's philosophy, which is that forestry and logging is not development, and that it simply changes the successional pathway of a forested area from, let's just say a mature forest to an early successional one that's going to become a forest again. And that's different from clearing for a future development site, building a road or a trail, putting in a commercial development, that sort of thing. So the way the draft reads right now, at least the intent was to exempt those activities, forestry, within tier 3 areas. But there's been some conversation outside of these meetings about whether that's actually the right way to go and whether that was the intent of the statute. So.
Yeah, well, so can I just add one thing? I think that no one at the department would argue that like logging, forestry, timber harvesting, that kind of disturbance in some of these areas might have a negative impact, and that has to be thought about. I think the overarching concern that we've got is that Act 250, from our perspective, probably isn't the right tool to deal with that. So I'll leave it at that. But I think that, sometimes when we sit in a room and we talk about Act 250, and Act 250 is the thing that we're talking about, and we talk about it a lot, we sometimes look at, if Act 250 is the hammer, everything's a nail. And sometimes it's not the right tool, but we try to apply it in ways that causes unintended outcomes going forward based on what we put together.
Right. Dana, I know you have an opinion and your hand's up. Go ahead.
Thanks, Alex. I raised the exact same issue that Charlie just brought up at our last meeting, so I know I'm not going to belabor that and double down on it, but that is something that obviously we have concerns with, and now hearing from you, Alex, that the board is now pushing back on that is extremely concerning to us. I will double down on the fact that the language in the current exemptions under 7, I think it's 7B, needs to be consistent with what is currently in Act 250. So the word logging needs to be applied there so that we just make sure that the language is consistent across the board. But I'm in complete agreement to the issue that Charlie's raising. And again, we brought that up at the last meeting in the middle of July.
You sure did. Annette, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to just speak to the actual impacts of what I've seen. In particular, these are projects that are regulated by the PUC, not Act 250, but then the question is, what's the role of ANR? And you know, my bias is in favor of protecting the resource, regardless of the type of development. So Sheffield Wind, we documented massive amounts of sediment coming off the site from logging operations. ANR's response to that was it didn't come under the permits that were relevant to the wind project, that it was separate. So apparently that's the best management practices. And we had aquatic biologists looking at it saying this was shocking. In Lowell, when there was a big flood and storms and a lot of sedimentation coming off the mountain while the wind project was in development, the response was that that was because of a logging operation up on the mountain that actually preceded the wind project. So if Act 250 can play a role in assuring that the environment is protected, then Act 250 should have some jurisdiction over it. And, if the logging industry wants to do a better job, or if they want to improve the BMPs, if they're, I've seen sedimentation in the streams on my property from logging jobs. So logging is, having a lot of effects on the natural environment outside of Act 250, but anything that can come under Act 250, I think should.
So maybe Dana or Charlie, you could speak a little bit to what the current protections are. I mean, I don't think, as you said, Charlie, I don't think anybody would argue that logging is not an impactful activity on the landscape. It absolutely is. But there are the best management practices and perhaps other venues or vehicles to address those impacts. Can you two speak to those at all?
I mean, just to kind of start, I think, one of the things that Annette brings up is this logging in connection with development of a wind turbine system. To me, that's not what I'm talking about. Like,
Right.
That's the development of a large scale energy development project. It happens to involve cutting of trees, but that's not forestry and logging.
Right.
So I think that just gets at one of the things.
The Lowell project is a separate.
Here. If I could just finish on that'd be
Yeah,
great.
hold on,
Thanks so much.
hold on.
So I think we need to be careful about, like, what are we talking about? And then when you get into things like Annette brings up, water quality concerns, which are a huge concern with forestry and logging. There's a lot of work going on through the Slow Camp Initiative to address this, and we're definitely not there yet, but we're trying to get there. But as far as regulations go, like, we've got the AMPs in place. Those are required on all current use enrolled parcels, and even those that are not enrolled, should there be a discharge that occurs, that property is subject to those rules and those regulations. So I think that we've got tools that we can look to outside of Act 250 to address some of this stuff. Another area within Act 250 that gets brought up a lot is around critical wildlife habitat. And I completely agree that critical wildlife habitat is extremely important and should be considered in the management of our forests. There's no argument there. But when you look to certain things like, say, deer winter areas, which happen to be brought up a lot, how do I phrase this? I think that the way they're addressed in Act 250 right now doesn't take into account kind of all of the things that are around protecting that resource and timber harvesting that need to be accounted for. And it could be something that would be better addressed through potentially revising the process with Fish and Wildlife. And I think there's conversations starting at a higher level than me around how the different departments can come together to address some of these things. So that potentially, the concern around how does this project impact deer wintering areas isn't necessarily addressed through the current path in Act 250, but it's something that Fish and Wildlife and FPR can come together on. Because oftentimes it gets brought up in these processes where it's like, well, Fish and Wildlife really wants us to put these regulations into a permit to govern this, when I don't think there's some of that conflict which is actually happening. So anyway, we can talk a lot about this topic, and I don't want to totally derail things, but that's kind of generally some points that I would raise.
Yeah, Annette, did you want to respond?
I just wanted to say that the Sheffield project logging was in relation to the wind project, but the Lowell issue was not. And so it wasn't, as Charlie was suggesting, a development that was part of another project. It was apparently preceded it, but every time anybody talked about the sedimentation coming off the mountain, it was that log job that was done. So I've seen enough. I had to have a logging job shut down on this property that adjoins mine. The streams were filled with 3 inches of sediment because they were driving through the streams after we'd had 3 inches of rain. So, anything that, and by the way, that was also part of a housing development that had a road rule that they made the road 799 feet, avoided Act 250. And so I really want to see Act 250 come into play on these developments and not be exempted.
Yeah, this was a tough one, right? I think when we talked about this at one of our prior meetings, it was actually you, Josh, I'm gonna out you, who said, why should we be considering that? Should we be considering, impacts, logging impacts? And I think the whole group, maybe not you, Annette, but I think most of the group was like, no, like that would derail even the idea of having tier 3 jurisdiction if that essential use on the Vermont landscape, was to come under Act 250 jurisdiction below 2,500 feet, in the same way that there would be a hue and cry if agriculture came under Act 250 jurisdiction because of a potential impact on a tier 3 area. And so, again, that was why when I wrote this first draft, my intent, although, again, it needs to be improved, was to reflect that conversation and say, no, there's a tradition and a history of Act 250 permitting not being the correct vehicle for review and mitigation of impacts for farming and forestry, at least below 2,500 feet. But I think the conversation helps. And, what I'm hearing you say, Charlie, is that there are protections in place. And when there are discharges of the sort that Annette was referring to that are known, there are AMPs that, are supposed to be brought to bear after the fact in that case. But I don't know if that's enough. And it's complicated, right? Because Act 250 is not a review process designed for logging operations. It was never intended to be that. It was meant to be for larger scale, commercial development more than anything else. But let me go to Dana, and then we'll go Josh, and then back to the room. Go ahead, Dana.
Well, you kind of took the words right out of my mouth, Alex. Let's just remind ourselves that under 2,500 feet, agriculture, logging, forestry are currently exempt. Above 2,500 feet, they are not. They require an Act 250 permit. And, major significant storms impact everything, regardless if it is a logging operation. Are we going to shut down every farm after a 3-inch rainstorm when there's sediment in a stream that runs through that farm? I don't think we are. So I think we've got to be very, very careful how we start to throw terms around and uses when they're already regulated in specific ways, and significant storms can't be predicted. And regardless of what you do with AMPs, I don't care if it's a farm or a logging operation, some of those things cannot be prevented, and Act 250 is going to do nothing to change that.
Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, just to come back, since, you brought it up, Alex, and I sort of asked the question because I was generally not sure tier 3 where it was going with ag and forestry, and the fact that you could have a logging operation that turns into a 1,000-head dairy farm on a critical sensitive area that we've determined needed new tier 3 protection. all that would be exempt, but a linear trail going through it would trigger it. I think that generally the tier 3 area, the need for it generally across ag, forestry, all these areas is not something that VLCT was ever on the record saying we're needing. So I'm not suggesting that tier 3 incorporate ag or forestry. I'm suggesting tier 3 areas be so targeted to such narrow areas that they're likely to be no development impact at all from any sectors. Otherwise, these huge carve outs call into question why we're even doing tier 3. I think is the bigger debate that's going to come up outside of this committee from lawmakers. That is a really obvious a sort of a scenario that could play out. And so I no more to add, just wanted to I'm not suggesting that I wanted it to cover forestry or ag. I'm suggesting that maybe tier 3 in general is unnecessary for the 99.9% of the state. There are maybe some small areas that do need special protection, and those probably should have no development. But we probably have protected many of those from other processes, and so it just raises a sort of I don't know, a big open question. I think that is a tough one for us to deal with. So sorry.
No, that's okay, Josh. I appreciate that. And yeah, wasn't trying to throw you under the bus. I think it was a good question you lobbed at another meeting. I just was hearkening back to why the draft sought to preserve those exemptions.
Yeah.
But you put a finer point on it, because you're right. Your point at that meeting was less about ag and forest being included and more about what the scope of the tier 3 areas should be, and that if they were truly the most sensitive areas, then maybe any kind of development would be jurisdictional. Okay, Billy?
Sure, I'm gonna move to a different topic, so if folks still wanna talk about ag and forestry, I'm happy to wait.
Yeah, do we have anyone who wants to speak further to that issue?
I guess there's one thing or two quick things I'll add is one is we talk about the exemptions for ag and forestry that exist right now. And we've talked about this, Kirsten, we've talked about this fast. Forestry does not enjoy the same exemption that ag does in Act 250. So I think we just need to be clear that like forestry is not exempt from Act 250 below 2,500 feet. That's a misnomer. The other thing that I'll point out is that the implementation of this, if we do pull things into jurisdiction, is I don't know how it would work in terms of if you're doing a timber sale on a property and tier 3 areas exist on the property, especially ones that are kind of dispersed across the landscape, like the headwaters areas, how there would be, how do I put this? How do you define the area that's in jurisdiction, the impact and the management of it in terms of what's applicable and not? So if you're cutting vegetation outside of the areas, but a road goes through it, is that exempt? Is cutting vegetation associated with the road exempt? Does the whole thing get brought in under the jurisdiction as far as the entire property and the timber sale and governing what's happening there? Because as written, the language is really vague and it could be interpreted multiple different ways. And under this current framework, you could see a property that's, say, 20,000 acres with a potential timber sale impacting a small area of tier 3, bringing the entire 20,000 acres under jurisdiction. Which from our perspective would create some pretty big issues
like
around.
What if tier 3 exists on the parcel, like, and it's impacted, does that exert jurisdiction over the entire parcel?
Yeah,
That's
so
not spelled out in the rule, I don't think.
the conversation that's occurred thus far, the board has been conceptually that if there was jurisdiction implicated by virtue of a tier 3 area, that jurisdiction would be limited to the tier 3 area. It's just a concept. The other thing I just want to quickly mention is it's already in the statute. There's a subset of types of permits, including earth extraction, logging, and solid waste permits that have a finite duration. And so currently for Act 250 permits that take effect for timber harvest logging above 2,500 feet. The permit is only in effect for a limited duration and only on the subset of the land where the logging occurs above 2,500 feet. So it doesn't create jurisdiction over the entire tract. And then when the term of the permit is concluded, the permit is no longer, jurisdiction is no longer in effect. That's been the application and interpretation of the current statute with respect to logging above 2,500 feet. So conceptually, in my mind, there would be no reason to change that. Before we leave this topic, I just wanted to quickly, like, in my mind, I've been sort of musing on like how could this be maybe reconciled? And I've looked at, like ANR put out this, information about the Shutesfield habitat connector. And I just took a really quick look at it and I saw a map that kind of had these are the more critical areas of that particular connector. Like sort of like almost like a gradation of sort of like low, medium, high, maybe. And I'm probably don't have it quite right. But I was just kind of wondering in terms of habitat connectors, if there's a way to incorporate forest management in a way that still retains the functionality of that resource. So I was wondering, just thinking about the again, the sort of like low, high value, and maybe some kind of successive approach to, again, ensure that it's not a 5 or 10 year just complete disruption of that connectivity on the landscape. So that's just kind of a little bit of where my mind went, but we can move on.
Can I just ask, I think
Yeah.
there's one thing that I did, and I get what you're saying, that above 2,500 feet, there's a time frame that's limited and there's a scope of area that's limited.
Yep.
But even under that process, if I understand it correctly, if a small area above 2,500 feet is included in the timber sale, some of the requirements that kick into play are essentially parcel wide. And I would say that like in terms of notification. So you look at some of the properties in the kingdom that span very large areas.
Yes.
If they need to do some work above 2,500 feet, all of a sudden they need to notify basically
Well,
every
there's-
landowner in 4 different
Well,
towns.
actually, no, they don't. They can ask for relief from that obligation. They can explain to the commission why the more peripheral, distant adjoining property owners don't need to be notified because there's no potential for impact.
Okay,
They have to explain why that would be the case. They can ask the chair for a waiver.
okay. And if that's in place, that's great.
Yes.
I don't know if that's being applied, because that's one of the things
Well,
we
so
hear
they're
a
very
lot,
familiar with the
is to
litigation
say
effort.
like, how come, so.
Yeah.
Charlie, I've been reviewing some of those 2,500 feet projects and we're like right to the line and then nothing below that.
In terms of like,
In terms of the review of the impacts.
Yeah.
Criteria.
which again, I think like,
There was a big Plum Creek project, I think that Kirsten's alluding to that. Yeah, they were gonna basically have to notify everyone who lived in like 2 counties.
yeah,
And I think there was resolution that narrowed that, maybe,
Um,
I don't know, but.
but it's something we.
It's a real issue.
Something we still hear from
Yeah.
folks like Weyerhaeuser in terms of,
Yeah.
this is what we have to deal with.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a case of like, it's not clear, or it's not being applied, or.
Well, the full notification was implemented. I know that because I was administering that particular application review. And, the applicant, was frankly declining to provide information in support of the waiver request. So that's what the rule prescribed. So, but, there certainly can be waivers, and that's from my perspective, like a great candidate for a waiver, right? I mean, there's land owned across multiple towns and so, but
Let's not
Anyway,
get too
yeah, I don't
sidetracked on
Yeah.
notification
Yep.
issues, because I think that's an administrative function that can be, pain in the rear end, but is not really substantive to what, this is all about. What I would say, Charlie, is that, again, my intent with the first draft was to, and I agree, it wasn't written in there so that you could see my intent, was to have it be impact based, to have the jurisdiction follow the tier 3 area only, and to have the same exemptions that are in the road rule apply under tier 3 with regard to roads for forest and farming purposes. So that you're creating a new road in order to do a timber harvest, that's not jurisdictional in the same way that it won't be jurisdictional within the road rule. And some of the language that Dana had pointed out is inconsistent. It's inconsistent because the road rule statute is inconsistent with the, other sections of statute, and I pulled it from the road rule. So anyways, the intent with the first draft was to try to provide fairly broad exemptions for forestry with regard to where the jurisdiction triggers, that it wouldn't be the rest of the parcel, and that those other disparate things that have to happen in a log job, would also not trigger. Again, that was the first draft. My mind, based on what I heard, it's not necessarily where we're going to end. So all these conversations are helpful to get us to where we might go with this draft. Let's
Alex, I had just one quick comment
Go
about
ahead.
that, where I think Fish and Wildlife is generally supportive of the idea that silviculture is not development, it's just a change in the successional state. But I think we've used to good advantage the ability to, when projects come into Act 250, to put restrictions on things like your wintering areas, on bare mass stands that affect the long-term vegetation management as permit conditions. And I think that's still really important to the Fish and Wildlife Department to have that ability to have some prescription about vegetation in those key areas.
And there's not really a way to do that except through the Act 250 process, right?
Right. Just Charlie mentioned those places, and I just want to say that we really appreciate the ability to be able to put those protections in place on those areas when there's projects in Act 250.
Gotcha.
And I'll just say that I think maybe inarticulately what I'm trying to describe is I don't think that anybody wants to not be able to do that. I think what I'm saying is I don't think Act 250 is the right tool given everything else that comes along with Act 250. Again, I think that sometimes we try to use Act 250 to accomplish things where Act 250 might not be the best tool to accomplish what we want to accomplish.
And I can just say definitively on behalf of the agency that we strongly oppose applying tier 3 jurisdiction to forestry operations below 2,500 feet.
Understood.
I'm confused. I'm sorry, you said oppose applying it above 2,500 feet?
Below.
Oh, below. Okay, sorry. I heard you say above.
And so, Bob, but you're saying that that's the avenue, that's the way in for you to be able to do something about deer winter areas and bare mass stands. Is there?
Yeah, I think my understanding is that sometimes when projects with those resources go through Act 250, then the conditions in the permit might have some impact on future silviculture. But it's not logging was not the activity that triggered the permit process.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
That's good distinction.
It's something else. Yeah,
Right.
that triggers it. Yeah.
Okay.
Can I move on to a different?
Yes, yeah.
So this is kind of a structural thing, but the definitions section
Yes.
in the proposed rule have defined these resource areas to their broadest extent. But the way that they're being used is narrower. And I don't know that this kind of works where you have a definition that says this term means this.
Yep.
But we're actually only talking about part of it. I think the definition section for the purposes of this rule needs to be the narrow thing.
Okay.
Because it will just be very confusing. Otherwise.
Significant natural communities is one of those that is different between the definitions and the.
Yeah, they're all that
They're
way.
all
So
different.
Billy's hitting on
A general.
a general point that is my way of drafting this was to try to reflect exactly the opposite of what you're recommending.
Right.
And I take your point.
Right. And I think you could probably have some sort of introductory thing of these resources are broad across the landscape, but for the purposes of this rule, we're defining them as
Right.
such or something like that.
I think that's an excellent point. It helps people understand where the rule is going from the outset, rather than having to, get to the third page where there's some technical language that then indicates, oh, but by the way, it's really a much smaller area that we're talking about.
And then one other thing, and this came up a little bit at one of your board meetings, and would appreciate especially Bob's input on this, but I think the idea of like how definitive the maps are and whether there is an opportunity or need for like a site-specific determination of the resource boundaries. And I think this group has long discussed the need for kind of bright line maps to just help this effort move forward in a way that's like administratively sustainable and predictable for landowners and communities. I think what I heard you as a board discuss is some opportunity for folks who felt like their property was inappropriately included in a tier 3 area to make some sort of showing to pull it out. And I think that's reasonable and probably necessary. I think what we're concerned about is an opportunity for people to petition or to argue that areas should be included in tier 3 if they're not mapped as such, because that would create a lot of work and a kind of a confrontational process that would require input from experts that I just don't know that the system can currently support. So I think like having a way for people to get out if their land truly isn't in a resource area, if there's a mapping error or something like that seems reasonable. I don't know if that seems okay to you. You know, and I think we need to create some process around that. So it wouldn't be like every time someone would make like a specious claim that they weren't in and we'd have to like do a bunch of work to determine that. But I think like neighbors or others arguing that somebody is in, if it's not mapped as in, I think that would open up a can of worms that would require too much administrative burden.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the thing that I keep saying about particularly the natural communities. If we use those, that those lines were never drawn with this idea that they were going to be the precise regulatory boundary. And there's going to be all sorts of error in there. And it's going to come up every time there's a jurisdictional opinion, I would imagine. And it's going to work in both directions. And either one is going to take a lot of work to sort out.
Yeah, and when Bob and I talked about this earlier, before this draft came together, we talked about, and with Billy, not wanting to overlap with existing adequate wetland permitting. And so the rare and very rare significant natural communities that were wetland types were going to be excluded from the tier 3 area. But there was the thought that issues with accuracy of the line, but also potential impacts of development immediately adjacent to a significant natural community might warrant a buffer in a similar way that the wetland areas through the wetland rules include a buffer. And so as a part of the mapping, you know, we've shown what a 100-foot buffer around those upland significant natural communities of rare and very rare types would look like. And if we are going to have, if we are going to have a site-specific resource delineation provision in the rule, I think we're going to need to clarify that it, especially with regard to if there's going to be a buffer around the significant natural communities, we are acknowledging that that's outside of the community, but is still jurisdictional. And that's a conscious choice we're making. So this buffer question is an important one as well.
Right. I think you'll have these questions about the line regardless of the buffer, because people will need to know where the buffer starts and ends, and that's going to be the contentious point.
Yeah, I was going to say was some of us consultants, and then Molly Mahar and I from ski race spent some time with Bob and Billy a couple of weeks ago just to understand the baseline of Vermont conservation design mapping and just try and wrap our head around in anticipation of the next rulemaking. And there's, because of the overlap here, where are the highest priority forest blocks? Where are the connectors? And just trying to understand, just have a common understanding of what the maps represent. And you know, as Bob's already said, you know, there's areas in there that are mapped as forest blocks that aren't, where there's connecting habitat that doesn't look like it, you know, is going to, there's going to be errors, I guess, is the bottom line. And so I think there's an expectation, maybe by the LURB and by the legislature, that there is, and quite frankly, I think, you know, most people want, right, some certainty, want to be able to look at a map and know whether I'm in or I'm out. So I certainly can put that hat on and advocate for that. On the flip side, I think you could spend years trying to ground truth the maps in a way that I don't know is manageable, quite frankly, for anybody. So what that leaves you with is sort of a case by case, analysis when somebody proposes something. And I don't know that that's satisfactory to people either, but I think that's what we're sort of facing, at least with some of the resources and how they're mapped. So at least for the ski areas, we're just trying to have a common understanding of what we're looking at first before we start talking about how we apply, a new criteria. And quite frankly, one of the things we're doing is trying to just get a baseline at each one of the ski areas to say what looks accurate, what doesn't look accurate, and why, just so we have a common sort of starting point for each one. And maybe we have a conversation with Bob and the agency just to say, here's what we're seeing. Because I think unless we have that common understanding, it's gonna be really hard to have a conversation about applying the new criteria. What does it mean? So anyway, I just want to throw that out because it's a recurring theme when we're at the legislature about maps. I know I've had many conversations over the years with everybody trying to figure out how we use the maps. Can they be jurisdictional? Can they not? And I think it's a fundamental thing we're gonna have to understand and struggle with and get comfortable with, or not. But I mean, at least have a common understanding. Like if Bob says, yeah, of course there's errors on it, and here's why, and we can't spend years trying to go back and look at every single area to correct it. That's not practical. But here's a way to go forward, acknowledging that this is what the maps show.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just, Liz Thompson, I just, agree, this is huge. This is a huge one. I mean, it's a huge issue. It's really, really important to take time and consider it, I think. Because I don't see, maps that don't express exactly what's on the ground as in error. I don't think those are map errors. I think it's just, we don't know. We don't have total knowledge. We just don't have total knowledge, and we never will. It will never be, total knowledge expressed on a map. It's just not going to happen. So there's always unknowns, and there's always things that need to be verified on the ground, and the boundaries of natural communities, for example, even the boundaries of wetlands. I mean, those are like, supposed to be perfect, but they're not. And there are certain things like elevation, that's probably pretty good. We probably know what's over 2,500 feet and what's not, but everything else is kind of like, and then you talked about the road crossings and the connectivity areas, low, medium, high, like, are those valuable? How are those determined? I don't know. I just think it's really huge, and to just completely rely on existing mapping and feels like problematic, I guess.
I think I think you're right. There are some areas that are always going to be fuzzy, that need some ground truthing. There's no way probably to map those. And then there's others that some of the things I'm thinking of, for example, is a forest block or something that's covering an area that's clearly not forest. Something that's just it's pretty black and white, and I don't think anyone would argue about it if they went and looked on the ground and compared it to the map, as opposed to what you're describing, whether it's a wetland or a natural community that's just not as the line might not be as bright, or something that you can articulate on a map with that level of accuracy.
And just candidly, our agency has testified for years that resource-based maps for jurisdictional purposes is an absolutely horrible idea for all these reasons, but no one listens to us, so that's what we're here.
We are, so we have to make the best we can with the knowledge and the data that we have. Go ahead, Jamie.
Well, I guess on that point, I mean, I see this process as being flexible. I mean, I don't recall an Act 181 statute that it delineated that we would rely on maps, right? It's allowing the rulemaking to define how to define these areas for jurisdictional purposes.
I agree.
So, I mean, we have to find the best pathway to do that, whether it's gonna end up being maps or something else. I think there is flexibility for us to talk about it. I guess I just wanna maybe orient, make sure I understand sort of the current thinking, at least in the draft. Would it be that there's going to be sort of I don't know if static is the right word, but there'll just be sort of a set of maps that will be used for jurisdictional purposes, acknowledging that they're not gonna be perfect. And that there will be the allowance through jurisdictional opinions to sort of flesh out any discrepancies. Billy's sort of suggesting it's not gonna be open for like petitions to add areas that aren't mapped, but that if somebody's coming under jurisdiction, they would have the ability to perhaps dispute that if they feel it's not accurate. And then would there be over time, perhaps updates to the maps if they're being used for jurisdictional purposes? Like, how would you, like, it's gotta be fluid over
Like,
time.
like every 5 year, every
Yeah.
10 year true up, something like that.
Yeah.
But there needs, like, I think like the mapping process should have its whole own public process, right? Like there should be like a map published and then a one-time opportunity within a window for people to weigh in on that. And then it's like locked for a while, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the better way to manage it than to try to do it on like a rolling.
I mean, I think Act 181 contemplated something along those lines. If you go back, and this is more of the forest block connecting habitat section, there's a section there on resource mapping that called for the secretary establishing and maintaining written procedures that include a process, science-based criteria for updating resource maps developed under this section. Before establishing or revising these procedures, the secretary shall provide opportunities for affected parties in the public to submit relevant information or recommendations. So I think there was some idea that the maps are going to be important. You're right, Jamie. It doesn't say they're going to be jurisdictional, but it certainly has language in here about.
Is that for the HC?
Yeah,
That's for the criteria.
Yeah, but I mean, we were all, many of us were part of those legislative conversations. The mapping was important. I mean, they were connected. I agree that Act 181 in terms of tier 3 doesn't say it must be based on map XYZ. But I think the assumption was that if you're going to have location-based jurisdiction, you're going to map it. And that's why the section that Warren read, in my mind, speaks beyond 8C. It's an A&R obligation to manage and update those maps on an ongoing basis. And I think Kirsten and I are, helping run a program that is not that. So we're gonna take the best information that A&R has and use it for a jurisdictional purpose. It was rough. But in my mind, it was kind of what Billy was saying, that that we would take a snapshot of data that was available today from A&R. We would create a jurisdictional map. And then as A&R tweaked and updated that over time, it wouldn't necessarily automatically update our jurisdictional map, but we would do that on some regular basis. I don't know, that would be 5 to 10 years. It might be sooner because we now have a professional board. And, after we get done with this first round, we should be nimble enough to update rules rather expeditiously. So maybe on a 2-year basis or something. And because there isn't a public process through the A&R mapping provision that the statute outlines, because you didn't get the staff that you said you needed to be able to really stand that up. For Act 250's purposes, we're going to do that. Each time we do the rulemaking process, we're going to expose these maps to the public and the legislature and say, we want to change them. We want to, this is 2 years later, saying we want to modify tier 3 to add these 3 areas, statewide or in this region or whatever. And here's a public process to go about doing that where people can question and all of that.
Okay.
But yeah, the intent, at least with the first draft, was kind of along the lines of what Billy was saying, is that we would take the information that we have today, we would dip it in amber, and also this site-specific resource delineation, which started this conversation thread. It was written with that philosophy too, that it would be an ability to correct and or delete based on actual on the ground information that directly contradicts what the map says, and not really a venue for addition. Because the way that we add to tier 3 would be through a public rulemaking process where everybody has their ability to say their piece and weigh in. That's not to say that the rule has to be that way. You know, it's possible that we do want our district coordinators to, I'm being a little cheeky, but that we do want our district coordinators to have to, you know, weigh competing wildlife professional delineations for a given parcel from a applicant and from two neighbors who are all saying, oh, the tier 3 area should look like this. But at least in this first draft, that wasn't really the intent. It was more along the lines of what Warren was saying, like, you've mapped this as a habitat connector and it's a parking lot. That's clearly an error of the map. You know, we want to stripe the parking lot. Do we need an Act 250 permit? No, you don't, because there was a mapping error. And that's what the site-specific resource delineation was more meant to be about, at least in this first draft. Bob, did you have something?
Well, I guess just to point out, I mean, I'm in agreement that we can't have prolonged jurisdictional opinion battles over the resource extent. I mean, we don't have the capacity of Fish and Wildlife to provide that input. But I think it is worth keeping in mind that there's those obvious cases where jurisdiction was too expansive. And there's going to be obvious cases where jurisdiction was not expansive enough. And the natural community goes on. And I don't know, is that going to mean that we're going to have a bright line and we're just going to say, this resource clearly continues, probably everyone agrees, but this part will not be part of Act 250 because it was not part of the map. And just to be prepared that those will happen.
Yeah, and what I'm saying is in this first draft, it does sort of read that way. That if the map doesn't include that extra area, but it should, you're out of luck. The resource is out of luck, I should say, until those maps are updated or.
Something funny going on with the meeting.
Okay, well, we can take a minute technical
Just like
break here.
try to leave and try to re-enter or something like that. Sometimes Teams, it's weird.
They just leave us?
I guess so. I guess they're coming back.
Yeah,
I didn't
I
see
lost
them.
sound with them for a second, so there's something going on with their
I
internet.
did too. I wondered if that was me.
Yeah, I think we all lost sound for a little bit, but
It was working fine right before Kirsten signed off.
Well,
yeah.
The audio seemed to be working fine right before Kirsten signed off.
I assume they'll come back. Yeah, I thought the audio loss might have been me. I never lose internet, but I was recording 2 different PUC oral arguments yesterday, and I lost internet during one of them, so I lost 3 minutes of audio. I don't think I've been in one of these meetings recently where something technically hasn't gone wrong. Josh, I liked your comment about whether tier 3 is necessary or not. I'm very glad to hear someone voice that.
Yeah, I'm scratching my head because there's going to be some big fights about some of this stuff. And I don't know if the juice is worth the squeeze, if we're either exempting a bunch of stuff or not exempting this. And, you know,
I think it's an impossible task.
what hasn't, you know, what is not being protected through
Yeah.
Act 250 in the places that aren't exempted now? How is that not working? What are the permits? I don't know. I'm glad to hear that they're slowing down to get some more time to talk through this stuff, because I don't think the decision makers in the State House are going to want to act on something that hasn't had its time to play out, and they'll hear from folks. And
Well, take a look at the article in VT Digger today about a Manchester housing project, which I've gotten involved in at the request of the neighbors. And it was because that it had been denied a solar site and now it's proposed for housing. And to my surprise, I learned that the only thing you can build through the interim exemption of Act 250 is workforce housing in floodplains. You can't build anything else in floodplains, but if it's workforce housing, you can build it in floodplains. So there's housing development. If you meet the criteria of at least 20% workforce or what they call affordable housing, then you're exempt from Act 250.
Affordable housing, yeah.
But only the poor people. So I sent it to an environmental engineer in New Jersey, and he sent me an article from the New York Times from July 25th, where the same thing is going on in New Jersey, and they're trying to put poor people in areas that flood for new housing. I had no idea this was going on elsewhere too. But I, at the end of this Digger article, I'm quoted as saying, I think that Act 181 should be repealed, because the more that I look at what's involved here, exempting all or eliminating Act 250 review and turning it over to municipalities, boy, it's a huge can of worms that people complain about consistency and predictability. I've never had to pay attention to local zoning. Now I'm having to grapple with reading Manchester's zoning bylaw, which is a very complicated document and has all this options for waivers and is nowhere as clear as Act 250. And it gets away from the municipal biases that come along. So I don't know if you know Bruce Post, but he used to be a staffer for Jeffords and Senator Stafford. And he, in his retirement, has taken an interest in Vermont's environmental history. So I said, I remember there was something about mobile homes and Act 250 and a lot of mobile home parks around the time Act 250 was enacted. So he went and dug up some stories for me about it. It turns out there was a separate task force for mobile home parks because they were seen by Governor Dean Davis as a good option for affordable housing, because guess what? There was a problem with a lack of low-income housing in Vermont in 1969. So it wasn't just about development at ski areas. It was also about this affordable housing for low-income people. And he was concerned about the aesthetics of mobile home parks and can we make them look better? And among those articles were statements by then Richard Snelling, who was labeled as an industrialist, about how he had not been in favor of statewide zoning, but that he had become in favor of statewide zoning because he saw that there needed to be some regulation. But then there was some man named Brett, his last name was Brett, who said that he was concerned about a switch to municipal housing. And I'm not going to give you the exact quote, but he used the word payroll. He said that municipal decision makers are often on the payroll of developers. And so it was a very interesting sort of view of the pathway that led to the regional approach through Act 250, rather than putting it all on municipalities. So statewide zoning was considered back in 1969. And for good reasons, they went away from it. Okay, now we're going back to it. And boy, watching the Manchester Development Review Board, the Design Advisory Board, I mean, these are good, decent people, but reading the regulations, looking at the process compared to Act 250, wow. I dread seeing this go on in municipality after municipality. It's something that the League of Cities and Towns really needs to get a handle on, because it's going to be a problem.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I disagree with some of that. I think the problem with Act 250 regulating housing, the 10 units, 5 miles, 5 years is completely arbitrary. Someone should have challenged that in court already. That has no basis in anything. And it's created rural sprawl like we've never seen. And even this at tier 3, where you subdivide 4, so you can have a 40 unit property that's in tier 3. So instead of building 10 units on 1 acre, they're going to divide it into 4 tracts of 10 acres and get 4 units in it. Anyways.
Yep. Well, those things can be fixed. They're back now.
Back.
ready to go, even though Jamie's still in transit, but I want us to get back there.
Stop recording and then start again.
That's awesome.
Just